If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mindshock True Crime. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. Today we are taking a look at a very, very perplexing topic, and that is the connection of missing persons cases. How many missing persons cases are truly connected? And how can that be determined? Particularly some of these more famous cases might be connected to less famous cases, and some of them not necessarily in the same area. Obviously, some criminals have a set travel pattern, either for work or whatever. If we're talking trafficking rings, for whatever reason, coincidence theorists really get triggered whenever the human trafficking angle is brought up, despite the fact that human trafficking exists, and a certain percentage of missing persons cases, they end up being trafficked. So it's kind of weird to just immediately write that off, but, you know, all kinds of goofs out there. But when trying to determine how many cases are connected and how they're connected, it can be really, really problematic. So we'll be going over that and more. As usual, if you find the Mindshock podcast interesting and informative, want to help Mindshock get more mind-shocking podcasts out there, and keep up awareness in cold cases, missing persons cases, and various unsolved crimes, wrongful convictions, keep up awareness. You can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast, like and share, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. So when you're looking at some of these famous cases, these really highly publicized cases like Johnny Gosch, if you haven't checked out the Mindshock podcast episode on Johnny Gosch, check that out. I mean, there's a lot of rabbit holes in that case. Some people believe that there was a human trafficking ring responsible, and they were also responsible for other local disappearances and possibly other more famous cases like Jacob Wetterling. Now, some people believe that that's an open and that's a closed case now, but others say that the DNA is non-conclusive. But it is weird because supposedly that is the clothes that he wore. So, that's a tough one. I will have to do a dedicated podcast on the Wetterling case. But looking at some of these cases too, with some of these individuals, like again in the Gosch case, you have these individuals identified. These 3 or 4 individuals that just happen to match the sketches of the suspects all the way in California and some other areas in anywhere from high to low profile cases. So it's not really an if. There are human trafficking rings operating all over the U.S. I mean, that's a fact. Some of them have gotten busted. Some of them are mere speculation and rumor, but grounded in quite a few pieces of evidence that seem to match, like, again, identical looking sketches. I mean, yeah, I guess it could all be coincidental. I mean, post Ted Gunderson's reveal of these political circles, law enforcement circles, all involved in human trafficking, it's kind of hard to ignore these possibilities and these theories. Of course, coincidence theorists, they'll ignore all of them forever because, they're too mentally weak to understand that criminals don't always act alone and that there are criminal rings out there that exploit children and traffic children. Despite, I don't know how many cases there have to be of that happening for some of these goofs to really open their eyes to it. And they just kind of pollute the true crime community with their cognitive dissonant Dunning-Kruger stylings, saying, oh yeah, that's impossible. That definitely wasn't trafficking. So it kind of gets in the way of honest and objective, logical, neutral investigation where you keep all options on the table and just simply see where the evidence leads you without all of these fallacies and mentally weak ramblings attempting to discredit clearly legitimate lines of inquiry and lines of investigation. So is it possible more of these cases are linked than thought? You have the Molly Bish case. You have all these other cases. It's really, really difficult because you would have to have cross-referencing every single missing person, every single missing child. Once you remove location, once you leave the door open for cross-state and cross-country rings operating, I mean, that's just really tough. That's really, really tough. All you can really do, I mean, and you have obviously in cases where there is a suspect description and a suspect sketch, you can cross-reference those, of course, but that's pretty much all you can do, because in a lot of cases there's not that much evidence, there are no witnesses, no video. So I mean, it's a question mark, it's an X value, but it's kind of hard to believe that X value is zero. It's got to be higher than zero, and if it's much higher than zero, I mean, that's a scary thought. Now, again, I'm going to keep referencing the Gosh case because it's so unusual, but there was even a woman who was photographing him several weeks before his disappearance. I don't know how publicized that fact is. I actually did not know that before looking deeper into the case. But is it possible some of these kids are chosen? Now, getting into even darker theories, again, stemming from the Gosh investigation, if his own father was somehow involved in some of these rings or illicit activity, and they clearly have blackmail on him, he wouldn't be able to blow the whistle on the kidnappers of his own son. How dark is that? So if there are compromised individuals, are they targeted? Because in the Gosh case, there's enough information, and the parents got divorced, so we do have his wife, former wife. Again, some people would say that she's not credible because of that, but there's other points of corroboration and independent verification from PIs, etc. But in these other cases where they're still together, or possibly the spouse does not know about any possible illicit activities, and therefore one of the parents possibly is in a blackmail situation where they would never be able to blow the whistle on the kidnappers of their own child because there's too much dirt on them by these elite trafficking rings, so to speak. And obviously these are very, very dark theories, but in a certain percentage of cases, if that's the truth, I mean, how would that be uncovered? Now, obviously, in a point of investigation, the family members are always looked at by investigators because in just a high percentage of cases, the family is responsible, unfortunately. But those are just the statistics. So you do have to rule that out. So you would think investigators look at it, but in cases where there is possible police complicity and corruption, again, like the Gosh case, with the police chief supposedly being involved in some of these upper political circles involved in these sex parties and human trafficking, obviously a police chief such as that would not allow, I mean, they would shut down legitimate investigation because they wouldn't want that kid to be found and to be able to identify these people, etc., etc. So there's a lot of cans of worms here that make it really, really tough, especially when cross-referencing a lot of these cases. And then you have international trafficking, of course. I mean, Eastern Europe is kind of known for a lot of, to be a hotbed of trafficking, but the U.S. too. I mean, it's also of note. I mean, you have foster homes and child protective services. Unfortunately, these are kind of hubs for predators and trafficking, because these are either orphan children or children from troubled homes with parents that wouldn't necessarily check up on them. These are prime targets for these predatory rings. So to have a complete resource of cross-referencing all of this, I mean, you'd have to have a gigantic, vast agency, preferably non-government affiliated, to weed out the corruption. You'd have to have like a private citizen network, a private investigating militia of sorts that has law enforcement capability and authority while not technically being part of the government. You'd have to have a major agency like that, like a Department of Homeland Security that's actually legitimate and competent and run by citizens with law enforcement authority, but not technically being part of the government in order to not be compromised. Because if these vast rings, if it's all true, I mean, obviously they would have a lot of individuals compromised in a lot of upper agencies. I mean, again, if it's all true, I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. It's weird how coincidence theorists would think that everybody would just blow the whistle on each other and investigate themselves if they're guilty. I mean, coincidence theorists just not known for their logical abilities or critical thinking of any kind. So that's really the only way I can see some of these, just to definitively find out which cases are connected or not. Now, in cases where there isn't a ring involved, the government's not involved, corruption's not involved, if it's just like a private individual or two, that's a lot easier to figure out if cases are connected. Because law enforcement agencies, of course, FBI, they're all more likely to legitimately investigate when it's not their own and there are no stand-down orders from above. So when there's a single perpetrator, that's when location is kind of more valid, because if people are going missing in the same area, it becomes more possible that a single individual is involved, particularly if the victims all share the same profile. Now, with advances in technology, also DNA tech and surveillance tech and all of these things, we are seeing some older cold cases getting solved. So that's definitely good. So when it's all said and done, many years into the future, hopefully a lot of these higher profile and, of course, lower profile cases all get solved. Will people be shocked at how many of these cases are connected that nobody has been able to connect before? Also, in the case of serial killers, I mean, not all of their victims are known either. So connecting missing persons cases with known serial killers and their victims, I mean, the amount of work to be done here, I mean, obviously with podcasts and the internet, I mean, there are amateur sleuths doing a lot of this legwork, and it is very helpful, even going through Jane Doe's and John Doe's, bodies that have never been identified or attributed to anybody. They could possibly fit some of these missing persons cases, and occasionally they do. There's tips called in, and there are resolutions. Unfortunately, there just are so many of these types of cases that it's very difficult to just randomly go through all of these. So, yeah, like my suggestion is, of course, some kind of citizen organization with the authority of law enforcement, with the authority to subpoena and investigate as necessary, get warrants, etc., where there is enough evidence. And, of course, I always talk about this, access to satellite data. Now, obviously, this probably wouldn't be that helpful to all these cases prior. I mean, I don't even know. At what point did most satellites start to be launched? So let's get an exact answer here. Does anybody want to take a guess what the very first satellite surveillance program was? At least in the United States. The Corona program. So in early 58, this is right from aerospace.si.edu. In early 58, a few months after the Soviets launched the first Sputnik, President Eisenhower authorized a top priority reconnaissance satellite project jointly managed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Air Force. Now, these were mostly used for satellite photos in various areas like the Soviet Union and China. And this program ended in 1972. So it was not a 24/7 video surveillance, particularly of the U.S., although it did take U.S. images as well. You can see them, images of the Pentagon, etc. Not necessarily helpful for true crime cases. At the end of the 80s, the U.S. launched its first radar reconnaissance satellite called La Crosse or Onyx. It provides medium quality images of a very large area or very good quality images of a small area. Interesting. In 1999, the U.S. launched the Future Imagery Architecture, the FIA program, with the aim of developing new reconnaissance satellites that could replace the KH-11 and the Lacrosse. The Boeing company was in charge of this program. The development of optical satellites has been abandoned due to cost. However, the first radar satellite from this development program, the Topaz satellite, was launched into orbit in 2010. So it looks like, yeah, there's a big gap here. I mean, I'm guessing it's mostly all classified info. Again, if anybody's seen Enemy of the State, I mean, they had quite advanced satellites. And if that's what was known, I mean, who knows what's classified. But either way here, it looks like there might possibly be something from the 80s, but mostly 90s onward, late 90s onward, there would be plenty of satellite surveillance to assist with these cases. So that's my suggestion for solving a lot of these cold cases, missing persons cases, unsolved crimes. You have this pool of information, and then you would have all of these citizen sleuths outside of government control, but with law enforcement authority. And I think if that was implemented, a lot of cases would be solved quickly. It seems like a lot of local departments really don't want cases solved. Not even necessarily that they were complicit and there's conspiracy going on, but mostly just due to egos, and they don't want their own incompetence or shoddy investigations brought back into light. So it's easier to just have some of these cases collect dust. And with an agency outside of the government, that wouldn't be a factor. So that's it for now. All the Mindshock listeners, feel free to chime in on connections between missing persons cases, how trafficking rings could possibly be responsible for a fair share of some of these missing persons cases, including some more prominent ones. As always, if you find the Mindshock podcast interesting and informative, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications. You can also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube for access to exclusive streams and chats. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.